Hi, I'm Shannon, the podcast producer here at C-SPAN. This week on the Lectures in History podcast, University of Dallas history professor William Atto discusses the decade leading to the 1787 Constitutional Convention. The convention took place from May 14th to September 17th, 1787, and debated how much power to give to the central government, how many representatives each state would have in Congress, and even how those representatives would be elected. Coming up, a discussion on the key compromises the delegates made that led to the ratification of the United States Constitution.
A Liberty Seguros agora é Yellow. Tudo aquilo que já era bom continua igual. Excelência e proximidade permanecem como nossa essência. Porque não é uma mudança, é uma evolução. A Yellow está sempre em sintonia com você. É liberdade com segurança. A melhor experiência acessível a todos os clientes, iluminando cada passo da sua jornada. Deixe essa luz iluminar seu caminho. Yellow Seguradora. Seguro para viver livre. Consulte seu corretor.
Good morning, guys. So, in the aftermath of the revolution, there are a couple things that are clear, abundantly clear. One of them is the fact of independence, right? That these colonies would now be sovereign in their own right and moving forward determine their own destiny. But aside from that, there are a number of things that aren't clear. And those would be the question of power in particular, the relationship of power between the states and the central government. And that was, a set of critical questions, critical enough that, John Quincy Adams referred to this as a critical period in American history, and that's why I have critical period up on the board. You don't see that term always utilized so much any longer. But it's very evocative of at least the idea that there's concern for nationhood, I guess I'll say, moving forward, right? Whether or not these states are going to cohere or whether or not they may go their own separate way, right? Because if you look at some of those, I guess I'll say, index of leading indicators, there's not a lot that bodes well for the idea of union. If you're really paying close attention in those years of the early to mid 1780s. So the critical period would be basically from about 1781, when this new national charter of government under the Articles of Confederation is established, and 1787 when we get to the actual Constitutional Convention, okay? What are those areas? Well, one of them would be in terms of criticality would be the government itself, as I said. What you look to for central guidance. This is a weak, very weak government, right? So if you're thinking about nationhood, then you might look to a central government as emblematic of that. But this is a central government that is a product of its own times. And so it's understandable that it is weak in some respects, right? Another area that you would have looked at that at least didn't bode well maybe for nationhood would have been Massachusetts. I mean, here's Massachusetts, kind of the focal point, if you will, of a lot of the radicalism, the hotheads, you might say, of the revolution in many respects. They are turning those energies against one another in some instances in Massachusetts, so that might not bode too well. And then lastly, in the Chesapeake, specifically in Virginia, where you have, certainly not all, but you have some of the leading statesmen from the period of the Revolution, right, who are, rather than sort of looking toward nationhood, they're looking toward commercial arrangements. They're trying to figure out how to settle, I don't mean to minimize them, but kind of comparatively small issues, right, if you weigh it against a nation in the balance, right? So that's what's at stake here. John Quincy Adams called it a critical period because it's critical if you're interested, as one historian said, in the United States as United States. The post-war downturn, economic downturn, was pretty much over by 1785, 1786. Most people had it, not all, most people had it presumably a bit better than they had had it before, okay? So nationhood really is the fundamental question, right? So let's look at these three areas and see specifically what the problem is. I'll start first with the government, the central government, the government under the Articles of Confederation. as I said, it is a product of its time, right? So if you're trying to throw off what you regard as onerous central authority, then you don't want to replace it with another onerous central authority, right? So when you look at the Confederation Congress, and the emphasis is on the Congress, by the way. In other words, it's on the legislative. It's not on the executive, right? They have an advisory board that handles executive decisions, but the focus is on the legislature, the Congress, right? You might say sort of people power, right? It's very, very weak. It has to, by this time in the 1780s, literally beg members to attend. Like, it can only beg attendance. It can't compel, right? It can provision an army on paper. It can't pay for it. It can ask for money from states, but it can't compel them to turn money over. If you want to change the Articles of Confederation, it's very, very difficult. You have to get unanimous consent to even amend that. So, it's not very impressive from the standpoint of nationhood to look at the Congress under the Articles and think, well, there's really not a lot that it can do. It doesn't seem to be able to compel much. Now, as I say, it has accomplishments of its own. I mean, it is the governing body during part of the American Revolution. It does successfully conclude the Treaty of Paris that ends the Revolution. So I'm not here to sort of bash the Articles of Confederation, as I said, but simply to understand it, again, as a product basically of its own time, right? Other area to look at, well, I might mention a kind of case in point here for this, Robert Morris. This is a kind of a good example, I find, of some of the sort of manifest weakness of this. Robert Morris was considered something of a financial wizard. He was the superintendent of finance during the Revolution and the Confederation period. Morris sought an ability to establish a national bank. Right? We'll be hearing more about this later on with Alexander Hamilton, but he wants to establish a national bank. He called it the Bank of North America. And the whole idea was that you'd utilize that bank to finance the Revolutionary War. It has some success, but I think his sort of post-mortem on this, his reflection on the Bank of North America after the Revolution is pretty telling. What he essentially said was, I had difficulty with this, and the reason why is because the states always objected to anything I wanted to do. I always ran into states, what he called sort of provincial jealousies. Right? Virginia wants to do this, Massachusetts wants to do that, right? Connecticut, something else. Again, it's that same old problem of how much can you compel as opposed to actually sort of asking. You have to go hat in hand and ask for a revenue, right? So again, pretty problematic in terms of nationhood. The other area, or a second area, I guess I should say, is Massachusetts. This again speaks to some of the financial issues and financial questions of the day. Massachusetts is not the only state that is having questions about finances, questions about debt, questions about how you repay them. It's just that it sort of explodes in Massachusetts more than it does anywhere else. Rhode Island, for example, had a problem with its state government just issuing paper money almost without concern, right? So that people who had to take that paper money eventually decided just to leave rather than be paid in worthless script. Right. Well, Massachusetts experienced a different problem. If you think about it in the aftermath of the Revolution, you have veterans, you have small farmers, you have mechanics, artisans, people who are trying to get on with their lives after that revolution. And in this instance, they don't feel often enough, particularly in western Massachusetts, that their concerns are being addressed. Some of them are in debt. Now think about it from the standpoint, especially of someone who fought in the war. You're in debt, you went away, you fought, you come back, you may be in arrears. That is, you're behind in payments perhaps. You need some kind of relief. When you go to a court system to try to get some of that relief, it's prohibitively expensive for you, right? So this starts a kind of groundswell, you might say, in Massachusetts of opposition to and protest against these kinds of high costs of justice, literally. What kind of relief are we going to get from our state government? And the focus would be on the state government. What kind of relief are we going to get from this debt? In truth, and you don't usually hear much about this, the state of Massachusetts was in the process of passing some debtor relief. But I would say pretty much it's a case of too little too late, because there are various groups, central Massachusetts, western Massachusetts, who are meeting. There is some evidence that some of them are being paid on a regular basis. It was reported, and not without reason, that several thousand were under arms, not all in one place, but that there were, as one observer put it, incendiaries who were closing down courts, right? Demanding a redress of grievances, right? And it sounds kind of familiar here. Got bad enough in Massachusetts that one Daniel Shays, whose name has always been affixed to this rebellion, not altogether fairly. I mean, Shays himself was a little bit surprised. He certainly led a band of about 1,200 of these rebels, but there were multiple groups actually in multiple places that closed courts in Massachusetts. In any event, this is the most pronounced event as far as this is concerned, because the close of the court and the state of Massachusetts raised up a local militia and went out to Springfield and fought a very brief engagement with Shays, these supporters, so-called Shayites, right? About maybe 1,200 of them. So it's a kind of one and done on that rebellion. It's very quick. One volley, they were more or less dispersed. But if you look at it again from the standpoint of nationhood, you are concerned about this kind of thing. If you're nationalist-minded at all, and we're going to talk some about some of these nationalist-minded folks, that probably doesn't bode very well that people are taking matters into their own hands. I mean, the state of Massachusetts, again, a bit of a demonstrator of the impotence of the national government. Massachusetts appeals to the Confederation Congress and asks them, will you raise troops to come help us suppress these incendiaries, these problems? And in effect, the short answer to that was no, but the basis for the answer, of course, was because they didn't have the authority to do it, right? So Massachusetts is asking for help from a national government that says they can't because, frankly, they don't have the authority to it, they don't have the wherewithal, and they don't have the funds if they wanted to, right? So again, a grave cause, you might say here, for concern about nationhood, right? Third here then, I'll say the state of Virginia, but the Chesapeake region generally. And this is what I was referencing earlier, that this area that produced a great many leaders in the midst of the Revolution. Some of those self-same leaders were engaged in debates over commerce. How do you arbitrate trade? How is Virginia and Maryland going to decide how we work out commerce on the Potomac? If you've ever been to Mount Vernon, for example, George Washington's ancestral home, if you stand out there and look at that beautiful scene of the Potomac, you can almost imagine people on both sides of it thinking, by way of states, how are we going to regulate this? Who has right-of-way? Who has access? Is one state going to tax another's commerce? All these kinds of questions come to the fore, and that's in part what a number of these folks are dealing with. And Virginia and Maryland, of their own accord, now we would be used to a national government handling these kinds of questions. Well, these are two states who decide to handle this on their own. So they, through their state legislatures, will get together commissioners to discuss matters of commerce, and without so much as a by your leave to the national government. They don't appeal to the Confederation Congress. Can we have these discussions? Do you have any input in these discussions? Right? That's sort of almost a foregone conclusion, right? Again, that is not even going to happen, right? So When those two states, Virginia and Maryland, managed to work out an amicable agreement, they thought we better broaden this out because there are other states that have questions as well. And so they did. They invited other states to send delegates to a general convention to be held in Maryland. That was the Annapolis Convention. And again, the idea was work out, some kind of commercial arrangements on other rivers, other waterways, just as they had done in sort of smaller form initially. So the Annapolis Convention in 1786 didn't really bode any better for some sort of national effort in this respect, because when you looked at the states that sent delegates to Annapolis, it was pitifully small. Every state was invited to come, send delegates, right? Vote up your delegates, send them here, let them come, right? But only 5 states bothered to send delegates to Annapolis. And if you're in attendance there and you think that, that doesn't bespeak a whole lot of interest in organizing national economic matters. So one of those who was in attendance there, fortunately, I think, in terms of the question of nationhood, was Alexander Hamilton. Certainly there were others, but Hamilton is key here because he's absolutely dismayed by what he sees. I mean, there's much to be said about Alexander Hamilton in this capacity. Hamilton grew up, and I may have mentioned him before, but Hamilton grew up in the West Indies. So he's very much attuned to maritime commerce, international commerce. He has that vantage point. He's very kind of cosmopolitan in that sense. He witnesses, you might say, the flags of many nations coming in and out of the Caribbean, right? He also, I think, personally for him, it's kind of important, was born of illegitimate birth believed that if he was going to better himself, he was going to have to do it through his own efforts, through his own merits. That was key to him. And he was sort of recognized by someone who thought he was of particularly high intellect, supported his attendance at King's College in New York, right? So your nationalists like Alexander Hamilton are not cheered by this, but he issued a call, sort of through his fellow delegates, issued a call to the Confederation Congress. We need to send out one more appeal. But this appeal will not be about merely economic matters. It will be, Hamilton said, to consider a government that is adequate to the exigencies of union. We need a new national government. Right? Something with emphasis on union, something that can actually supply the needs of a nation moving forward, right? If we don't, Hamilton's grave concern, and then any number of other nationalists, was that union was going to be short-lived at best, that these states would go their own separate ways, that you would have maybe 13 separate competing confederacies. Who knew? There was a movement actually in present-day Eastern Tennessee and Eastern Kentucky to form up a state, and just think about this, form up a state called Franklin, and maybe attach themselves to the national government of the United States, but maybe actually appeal to Spain, and maybe just simply be absorbed by Spain, right? So you're going to look at all these kinds of things going on, right? You can understand this concern over the ultimate future here of nationhood. Well, so Hamilton has this sort of prescient call for a new convention to, as I say, consider a new form of government. And even as he's in the process of doing that, he is also taking cognizance of a number of revisions to existing state constitutions. Now, this had been a process that was underway for some years, and I think this is especially important in the sense that it parallels a lot of the thinking about the national government, right? In other words, if you look at any number of state constitutions that were formed during the Revolution, and I want to be careful about overgeneralizing, but the focus is usually on the legislative. The focus is usually on sort of enhancing the popular element within it. Frequent elections, usually, as I say, emphasis on the legislature, not a two-house legislature. We want speed, we want connection to the people, right? Those are the kinds of things that are important to us. Well, beginning about 1780 or so, you start to sense that some of these state legislatures are reconsidering what they had been doing in the midst of the Revolution. That might have fit the era of the Revolution. And you can understand it, again, as I say, in the context that you don't want this onerous governor or some judiciary or something like that, right, lording it over the legislature. But that won't do moving forward. That is to say that we need a more deliberative process. This is going on at some of these states. I'll give you an example or two here. Massachusetts in 1780 is going to charter a new state constitution. They split their unicameral legislature in that new Constitution of 1780 so that it has an upper house and a lower house. And they, in essence, force those two houses to work together. One of them is popularly elected. One of them is based on whether or not you pay property taxes, right? Which certainly would not have been everybody. So you're going to have to, work together. We don't have just simply one house, we have two, right? And we're going to make them work together. New Hampshire in 1784 is another one of these state constitutions that makes a substantial change away, I would say, not ending, obviously, popular representation, but slowing things down a bit, making a more deliberative process, and not putting everything under the authority of the legislature. What New Hampshire does in 1784 is to say, we want our governor to appoint our judiciary. We don't want the judiciary to be selected by the legislature any longer, right? Because what all too often happened, the argument was, is that the legislature is coming to control all, right? And there's not ultimately that deliberative process, and too often potentially a rush to judgment. Popular majorities are a good thing, but popular majorities are not always right. Majorities don't always do the right thing. And so I think at some of these state levels, you start to see that. Virginia, incidentally, was another one, considering some changes that would make their legislative process, their governing process, more deliberative, a bit slower, right? And take a little bit of the authority that was vested largely in the Virginia House of Burgesses and give more to the governor and to the judiciary. So, they have some basis for this at the state level, right? So back to Hamilton's call here for a convention. That does get issued by the Confederation Congress. And if you think about it from the standpoint of the Confederation Congress, they're seeing, how shall I say, sort of the writing on the wall. Shays' Rebellion does not encourage them, right? I mean, it lights a bit of a fire under them, right? Hamilton, Washington even made reference to potential incendiaries in various states out there, right? So they have some incentive here to as Hamilton said, develop a union that was adequate to its own exigencies. I can't say that word this morning. They called for a convention to be held at Philadelphia. That call was issued by the Confederation Congress in February of 1787 to meet in May of 1787. And just over 70, about 74 delegates from every state except Rhode Island. Rhode Island was the lone sort of holdout here. I'm concerned clearly about the proceedings, but the other 12 states sent delegates that totaled about 74 at one time or another. 55, so you get a lot of rotation here. Some come in, some leave, that kind of thing. Alexander Hamilton is there for a period of time as part of the three-man delegation from New York. He has to leave for a period, unfortunately, when his two fellow delegates from New York are not happy with the proceedings. So you get some change, right? Some flux in and out in the midst of it, right? But in terms of who is attending here, well, there's some of the folks you would expect, but there are also some notable absences. And I'm gonna mention first those who aren't there that you might have expected to be there. And there's some good reasons, I think, in many instances why they're not. I like to start with Patrick Henry, who, after George Washington, probably has the most name recognition of any American of the time. Patrick Henry refused to attend. He said, "I smelt a rat." I'm gravely concerned, clearly, about what they intend. As they began to assemble, among other things, they decided to not have public observation of their proceedings there in Philadelphia. Well, why? Patrick Henry's concern was, but because they may well be plotting something that, to him, as he said, smacks of George III. All right, so Patrick Henry is not in attendance. Thomas Paine, you might have expected Thomas Paine of Common Sense fame, and he was a vigorous participant in the American Revolution to have been there. But Paine is in Europe and France in particular, sort of fomenting revolution in France. Thomas Jefferson is not there. He is serving on diplomatic duty abroad, as is John Adams. So neither of them are in attendance here. Didn't stop Thomas Jefferson, by the way, from referring to this convention that assembled there as an assembly of demigods, which, while a bit of an exaggeration there, I think as long as we're not too cynical, you can understand Jefferson's comment. That is, that there is a pretty impressive assembly of individuals who are in attendance, right? Ben Franklin is there. James Madison, of course, of Virginia is there. It would have been very hard to have imagined the Philadelphia Convention ultimately in terms of its ability to kind of secure some level of support without George Washington's support. Washington being someone that was widely trusted. He was the American Cincinnatus. He was someone who had laid down power when he had the opportunity to take it up. So if you were worried about this turning into a power play, a power grab, something sort of anti-populist in that sense, then presumably George Washington's presence, his support from it would give you some comfort, right? Some sort of pause that, in fact, that isn't what it was all about. So there are some crucial attendees there. Alexander Hamilton, of course, as I said, he wasn't able to stay the entirety of the time, but nonetheless is there. I'll have to mention him as kind of the sort of leading figure among a group of sort of new nationalists. If you put yourself into that meeting in Philadelphia, if you were there in Independence Hall, all right, it's the Pennsylvania State House. It's like Washington is up here gaveling everything to order. As you look out, well, what do you see? Well, you see a lot of, I'll call them older revolutionaries, right? People who were present, during the, maybe during the Stamp Act Congress, or who at least had fought in the American Revolution. And with them, you're familiar, but there are a lot of other folks there who perhaps not so much, right? People who may have been, I don't want to say cutting their teeth really during the Stamp Act Congress, but were sort of maturing into very young adulthood in the late 1760s and into the early 1770s, right? So 22 of them had fought in the American Revolution. So you have a fair number of veterans of the war out there, and as they sort of considered things, they are looking for, and I'm not saying they're abandoning their states, but they're looking at the idea of nationhood. They're very much attuned to the idea of their nation. Whereas if you're going to look at someone who maybe was a bit older, they identified mostly with their state, right? I'm a Virginian, I'm a Marylander, I'm from Connecticut, that's what I identify with, that's where my government is. And that's what I'm most concerned about. And in these proceedings, if I find that my state is going to be overridden by some government that's created here, then I'm going to be very leery of that and stand maybe in opposition to it in the context of this. Well, these new nationalists had fought for a nation as they understood it, right? They fought, as has been said often enough, under one flag and largely for one principal leader, and that leader was George Washington, who, by an amazing coincidence, happens to be on my tie today. Washington was, as I say, the father of the country. He had laid down power. He was the American Cincinnatus. That was who they looked to, and there he was gaveling this convention into order, right? So as I say, that gave you some repose. It also gave you a little bit of repose that the executive authority was not going to overawe the states. Well, you have to go some ultimately before you can ever come to that conclusion. There are a whole bunch of questions here that are going to have to be answered by this convention. If you believe that you needed a new central government, well then what did you need this new government to do? That is sort of the first, you might say, set of questions. What should it be able to do? Well, I think by way of comparison to what the Articles of Confederation, what the Confederation Congress could not do, that was one of the things that sort of directed you toward what this new government should do. It should be able to tax, right? It should actually be able to tax if it's going to be able to do anything. It should be able to regulate commerce, right? You think about what happened to Virginia here and that it couldn't really do anything to affect that. We can't just have states going it alone, right? So it needs to be able to regulate commerce. It should be able to print its own currency, right? That's been a constant problem with respect to these various states printing their own money and sort of going it their own way. So we need a uniform, standardized currency that you can do business with regardless of what state you're in, and of course for the country to do business with other nations. So those are some fundamental questions. And also I might add fitting out a military, right? Actually being able to fit out a military, not just putting it down on paper, but having the means requisite to filling those ranks, okay? So those are some of the fundamental questions that are being asked here. Well, so the first plan that's put forward is by a Virginian named Edmund Randolph. And it's called the Virginia Plan, maybe not too surprisingly. And the Virginia Plan gets the lion's share of the attention, I think, in terms of the Constitutional Convention. And I'll just lead with sort of the end in a certain sense here. It gets, I think, the lion's share of the attention because it's the plan that's adopted as a working model for the convention. Right? James Madison, father of the Constitution, also a Virginian, is going to work very much within the framework of the Virginia Plan. Well, here's the thing about the Virginia Plan. It will alter the form, and this is critical about this, it will alter the form of the government. But what it really doesn't do so substantially is alter the substance of it. And what I mean by that is alter the substance of its power, the national government. The Virginia Plan is usually looked upon, as I say, as this nationalizing plan. Well, it wants a stronger central government. The reality of the Virginia Plan is that it actually benefits large states, first and foremost. And that's one of the things about it, I think, sort of the misunderstandings, if you will, or misapprehensions about the Virginia Plan is that it isn't strengthening the central government as much as people, I think, sort of at a popular level presume that it probably did. So yes, it says scrap the Articles of Confederation. Yes, in terms of the changing of the form, we want a two-house legislature. It calls for a bicameral legislature, right? Yes, it wants a judiciary, so does the competing plan here. But having said all of that, it wants proportional representation, right? Proportional representation. Well, there's the rub if you're a small state, and I mean small maybe physically, but especially small in terms of population. If you don't have the numbers, then you have grave concerns about the Virginia plan and its call for proportional representation. What do they mean? I mean, in the Senate and in the House, I want representation based on the numbers in the particular state. Well, that is going to advantage these large states clearly. Virginia is the most populous state in the United States, in the confederated states, if you will, at this point in time. So it gives it some obvious advantages, you might say, right? So there's an alternative plan that's put forward here, right, by William Patterson of New Jersey, so the New Jersey plan, right? They keep it simple here, Virginia plan and New Jersey plan. Sometimes, again, referred to as a small state plan, right? It was Madison, by the way, who came up with this large state versus small state kind of descriptor. And he was really thinking largely about population. Like larger states seem to go more, he said, and it's Madison, and so Madison's onto something here. Larger states seem to go for the Virginia plan, smaller states for the New Jersey plan, right? Well, the division is a little bit clear, actually, if you look at land claims. Which states are landed, which are landless, and is that going to change ultimately moving forward? Because some of these states have tremendous western land claims, right, which they are going to ultimately cede over to the national government, but that's not abundantly clear at this point. So the New Jersey plan is going to call for an amendment of the Articles, not the scrapping of the Articles of Confederation, right? We're not going to do away with them, we're going to amend them. This, incidentally, is I think where some of the source of the misunderstanding or the misapprehension comes from about the New Jersey plan, because at that point it sounds like, oh, well, you don't really intend any change. You're going to amend them. That doesn't sound, how shall I say, very substantial, just to amend them. They want to continue with a single house legislature. Yes, they would have an executive. It would essentially function as a plural executive. It did call for a judiciary, right? But it didn't call for proportional representation. It called for equality of representation, right? So equal representation in that single legislative body, right? Every state gets the same, okay? So equality of representation. Aside from that, and this is something that, again, as I say, don't really hear too much about the New Jersey plan, it will load the central government with power. So again, this is sort of contrary to typical thinking about this, that the New Jersey, those smaller states, however you want to determine their smallness in terms of population, in terms of physical size, and often enough those things will go together, it's actually the one that wanted to load the central government with power, okay? Why? Well, largely because their concern was, that's the best place for us to secure so some modicum of representation. If not, we're going to be overawed by these larger states. Our fortune will be better guaranteed, our fortune's better secured in a strong central government that can make sure that states like Virginia or states like New York don't end up overawing us in the context of this government, right? So the government that comes out under the United States Constitution actually has central powers that are much more akin, frankly, to what's being called for in the New Jersey plan, even though its form, of course, is going to look very, very different, okay? Well, so the Virginia plan is adopted by a 6-4 vote, and so began the deliberations, and there are a huge number of them, as you might imagine there would be, and the convention ultimately is a bundle of compromises. Much compromising, as I've suggested already, is necessary here. And the first one, and the one that is ultimately the greatest threat to the convention, is the question of representation. It takes about a month to get through this. This was the issue on which some delegates to the convention represented, as one said, that things are at a full stop, that it looks like we're just going to break up and go home. And two individuals who helped overcome that impasse were a delegate from Connecticut by the name of Roger Sherman, who suggested that instead of trying to deliberate in a larger body, let's have every single state send one rep to a smaller meeting, and we'll see if we can work it out in a smaller group and then report back to the larger group. Right? So that's Roger Sherman. This is the formation of the so-called Great Compromise. And the other individual who played a central role in this was Benjamin Franklin. Franklin was 81 at this point, and he took a nap occasionally during the proceedings, during the convention, which, as I say, I think he could be forgiven for. But in any event, it was Franklin who said we should have equality in one, in the upper house, and proportional representation in the other, and make sure that the money bills originate in the body that is closest to the people. So the House will have control over the purse strings, right? That was the Great Compromise, and it was something on which ultimately, if it didn't satisfy everybody, and nothing here satisfies everybody, I mean, make no mistake, but satisfied enough to overcome that problem, okay? Another, I think, obvious issue in terms of the compromises has sort of necessitated here with the question of slavery. Up front, I think I will say that if this convention had tried to, in any way, I'll say, get at the institution of slavery, end it, put it on the road to retirement, that undoubtedly would have been a showstopper for this convention, right? The best, and I'll put Hamilton in here, the best Hamilton could do, and there are others who are sort of like-minded, but Hamilton, I think, principally on this, was to get the convention to agree to review the international slave trade, which they would allow after 20 years. So if you look at the outlawing of the international slave trade, there's a reason why it's not going to be reviewed until 1807. It's because it's 20 years after the Constitutional Convention, and then finally outlawed in 1808, right? Instead, the question of slavery in terms of representation, the so-called 3/5 compromise. So for purposes of both political representation and taxation, you could count 3/5 of the total population, or 3/5 of a slave, if you will, for purposes of both representation and taxation. The obvious concern there is, and we may get into that in the Q&A a little bit, but the obvious concern here was giving an undue advantage to states that had more slaves, right? Lastly, the question of the executive, right? The executive occupies a huge amount of time, and principally the question was, how do you choose the executive? Someone early on in the convention floated the idea of what becomes the Electoral College. And I have to smile at this a little bit because everybody disregards the idea. When they first hear the idea of Electoral College, and we'll talk about it here, it's cumbersome, unseemly, ungainly, inefficient, right? A lot of the things that you hear about, the criticisms of the Electoral College today, people launched many of those then. So what happens? Well, they come back to it toward the end, and I mean when there's about 10 days left in the entire convention. And what they found was that was the one vehicle, that was the one procedure, that was the one method that overcame everybody's, to the extent that you could, objections to how you chose this executive. They knew they were going to give their executive considerable power, and the almost breathtaking power. I think that's one of the things that's not necessarily always obvious. This president is going to be commander-in-chief of the military. This president is going to have the duty to see to the execution of the laws. This president is going to handle foreign affairs. One person, right? That looks like a monarch in waiting to some. So just their ability to agree to that is pretty earth-shattering, right? But how do you choose? Well, literally 1 week, maybe 10 days before the convention was closed, it would have been Congress who would have chosen the President of the United States. We would have literally had congressional government. The Congress would have chosen the President. The President would have made nominations to what becomes the Supreme Court, to the national judiciary, if you will. And so, in essence, those other two branches of government would have been dependent upon Congress. The Electoral College prevented that from happening, right? The procedure was for the state legislatures to vote on, or the people of the states, as the legislatures might choose, to vote for electors. So the people would vote for the president, but the electors would elect the president. So 2 electors for your 2 senators, and then an elector for every representative that you had in Congress. Those would be the total number of electors that you would have. That was the, as I say, sort of the somewhat, some regard as kind of an artless answer to how best to choose the executive. But as I say, it rendered the president and the judiciary relatively independent, right, by virtue of that choice. So the Electoral College was the one singular, unique innovation of the entire Constitutional Convention. It is brand new, right? Nobody has ever done anything quite like that. And that kind of finishes off, I guess you might say, this system, finally, this federal system of separation of powers, right? The states would not be overawed in this system, right? They still have a role to play, particularly in the United States Senate. And it is a divided power, right? We say a federal republic, not simply a democracy, okay? Okay, so we have a few minutes here. How about some questions? Yeah, sure.
Why were people so skeptical of nationalism? Because it seems like it's just giving up civic individuality to form a stronger state. And if I was in a new country, I would want that, especially with like the threat of war from other nations still being a thing. And then secondly, what exactly was a state giving up to join a broader nation?
Yeah, great question. So let me repeat there, just to clarify again. Why would people be skeptical at all of nationalism? Well, if you remember those who were not nationalists at the convention, for example, right? They identified with their states. They were habituated to identifying with their states. This is sort of organic. Ever since they were colonies, you identified with your states, right? So now you have this concern that what's going to happen? Is my state going to be swallowed up by this? Whether it's by the national government, and even more specifically by the monarch, by the monarchy, right? Some of the opposition, who will end up taking the name anti-federalists, we'll talk about that a bit later on, but the anti-federalists worried that this president was going to be a monarch, and that is some of the very specific language that they employ, right? So there are a number of reasons for being leery, right? Just as with those nationalists, they were, as I say, habituated to thinking of the nation. That's what they'd fought for. That flag, those 13, the stars and stripes, right? That's what they had fought under. And if you hadn't, if you had sort of grown up in those years of onerous central authority, the Stamp Act, Congress, those kinds of things, you were much more skeptical of it, I guess I'd say, much more fearful of it. Yeah. What else? Good question. Other question? Anybody else? Yeah, sure.
So how were, in essence, like states' rights kind of discussed and reviewed in the during the Constitutional Convention? Like, how were they involved in all that?
Yeah, great question. I think, again, one of the things, so the issue of states' rights, a lot of that comes out in the, say, for example, the debates over, 3/5 compromise. Or even the debates over the issue of representation, right? Is my state going to be overawed? I think the one thing that, not the only thing, but one of the things that gave, states' rights devotees, and there were a great many of them, pause, was that they were going to have to go back to those states and ratify this, right? I mean, in other words, it's one thing to agree to something there in Philadelphia. So when they report that back out to the actual Confederation Congress, then you have to go back to the states themselves to actually begin the process of ratification, right? Now, for some, that's not going to make them happy. They're still not happy, right? But at that level, at least, you get back, you might say, and I'm thinking of those who are not, as I described as these nationalists, but sort of the older school, if you will, then they're back on their home turf. I'm back at my state legislature, or at least the ratifying convention. This is where I have the opportunity to consider, are the rights of the states being overawed by this government? And clearly there are going to be a substantial number who are never convinced that their states will not be overawed by this government, are not going to be reconciled to it at all. And it's an enduring issue, of course, that we'll be talking about at some length, sure. Yeah. Anybody else? Okay, well, have a good rest of your day. See you guys on Wednesday.
Thanks for listening to this week's Lectures in History podcast. To find even more history content, visit c-span.org/AHTV.